So we're continuing our series through the kings here, and we're coming up to Uzziah, or we'll see in 2 Kings, Azariah. So go ahead and turn to 2 Kings chapter 15. There's actually not much in 2 Kings on Uzziah. Actually, it doesn't mention Uzziah, it mentions Azariah. So Azariah, Uzziah, it's the same person. And what we'll see here is that Uzziah reigns for a pretty long time. He reigns for 52 years. So he's, besides Manasseh, he's the longest one to reign here. So you see Uzziah here. He's jumping in here during Jeroboam, the king of Israel, and pretty much through that, because Jeroboam reigns for a long time too, but he's going to go all the way into Pekah, son of Remaliah, and it's getting down close to the end there. And we know that the beginning of Hezekiah's reign, that's when Israel's taken captive and they're taken out completely. But Uzziah is going to reign for 52 years. And in 2 Kings chapter 15, there's actually just 7 verses on Uzziah here, but he's called Azariah here. You say, well, why is he called Azariah? And in another place he's called Uzziah. In the New Testament, it's Uzziah. So it's like an O when it's transliterated in the New Testament when you're dealing with the genealogy in Matthew chapter 1. But the reason I believe that's the case is because the priest was called Azariah. So you had 2 Azariahs, so it makes sense that when you're talking about that priest, because the priest isn't mentioned here. It mentions that he becomes a leper, but it doesn't get into that whole story how that happened. Okay, it just basically says God smites him with leprosy. But it makes sense when you're reading through there that he'd be called Uzziah instead of Azariah, or someone would be changing their name, so you're not getting mixed up with who's talking. Is it the king? Is it the priest? Or whatever. But Uzziah is the one that when you go to other passages as far as Isaiah, and I'm going to show you in some of the minor prophets, it's Uzziah. It's not Azariah that's mentioned. But I believe it's the same person. He just had a different name or a different way of saying it. But going on in 2 Kings chapter 15, verse 1 there, it says, in the 27th year of Jeroboam, king of Israel, began Azariah, son of Amaziah, king of Judah, to reign. 16 years old was he when he began to reign, and he reigned 52 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Jechaliah of Jerusalem. So we know it's the same person. I mean, when you're reading 2 Chronicles chapter 26, all the information is the same. It's just that the name is Uzziah instead of Azariah. But he's 16 years old when he begins to reign, and he reigns for 52 years. And so Amaziah reigns for 29 years, okay? So that means that it was like in the 13th year of Amaziah's reign that Uzziah was born, and kind of gives you an idea where he's at over here as far as how old he is and all that. But he's pretty young. I mean, 16 years old to be taking over a kingdom. But he's going to reign for 52 years, okay? Now, I just want to read the rest of this because really 2 Kings gives you a quick synopsis of Uzziah as far as him being, doing right inside the Lord. He becomes a leper and then he dies. It's kind of like very quick, whereas when we read this whole chapter in 2 Chronicles, it gives a lot more information as far as what happened with them, what was going on. And so going on there in verse 3, it says, and he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Amaziah had done. And you kind of see the same thing when you had Amaziah. It says the same thing about him. He did that which was right in the Lord as his father did. And so remember, Joash was Amaziah's father, and so he's kind of going back to that. But they all weren't perfect. They weren't walking perfect in the Lord like David did, right? But going on from there, it says in verse 4, save that the high places were not removed, the people sacrificed and burnt incense still on the high places. And the Lord smote the king so that he was a leper unto the day of his death, and dwelt in a several house. And Jotham the king's son was over the house, judging the people of the land. And the rest of the acts of Azariah and all that he did, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Judah? So Azariah slept with his fathers, and they buried him with his fathers in the city of David, and Jotham his son reigned in his stead. So that's it. The 2 Kings just covers that portion of it. But do you see, it's just like all of a sudden he just gets smitten with leprosy. You're like, oh man, that escalated quickly. Like you're kind of thinking of the fact of, okay, he's doing right. Israel or Judah's still messing up with this stuff. But you see that high places, and they're offering incense, sacrifices, all this stuff in high places. That's going on. So, yeah, I mean, the king at that point was doing right, but he wasn't reining in his own people. You know, they were still doing some wicked things, and these high places weren't taken down and all that. But let's go back to 2 Chronicles chapter 26. And I want you to see here that Uzziah, the first thing he does when his father dies is he restores Judah. Okay? So, in verse 2 of 2 Chronicles 26, it says, he built Eloth and restored it to Judah. After that, the king slept with his fathers. Well, you know, you think about the fact that Jerusalem and all this stuff was kind of messed up, you know, with his father, with Amaziah. Remember, Amaziah went to war with the king of Israel, and Israel basically came back and spanked him, you know. Basically brought him back home and tore down some stuff. And in chapter 25, we see that. So in chapter 25, in verse 22, it says, and Judah was put to the worst before Israel, and they fled every man to his tent. And Joash, the king of Israel, took Amaziah, king of Judah, the son of Joash, the son of Jehoahaz, at Bethshemesh, and brought him to Jerusalem, and break down the wall of Jerusalem from the gate of Ephraim to the corner gate, 400 cubits. So, you know, he basically took them home and spanked them, you know, and just like took down some of their walls. So you can see how he's building up Jerusalem, he's building up Judah, and he's taking care of things after his father dies, because it wasn't exactly left to him in a good state, right? Because after that happens, remember, there's a conspiracy, and Amaziah was killed and all that stuff. So, but going on here, we see that Uzziah, he's doing good. I mean, as far as some of the stuff that's being done by him and all this, but kind of like Joash, it's predicated on him having a good mentor. Remember Joash? Who was his mentor? Who was the person well, first of all, the one that saved him was Jehoiada, the priest's wife, right? And then Jehoiada obviously was involved in that. But it was all the days that Jehoiada was alive that Joash did right. Well, kind of goes the same way with this, only that there's this man named Zechariah. Now, I believe this is a different Zechariah than Joash's son Zechariah, Jehoiada's son Zechariah that Joash killed. If you remember, he was martyred and all that. But it says here in 2 Chronicles chapter 26, verse 4, it says, he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that his father Amaziah did. And he sought God in the days of Zechariah, who had understanding in the visions of God, and as long as he sought the Lord God made him to prosper. Okay? So in the days of Zechariah, so I believe this is a different Zechariah that was killed, and this is a different Zechariah that we see the book of Zechariah. Now, when you look at this, you can almost think, is this the Zechariah that's, you know, the minor prophet? But we know that Zechariah is taking place after the captivity, okay? It's very clear if you're reading the book of Zechariah, he's talking about the temple, he's talking about people that, like Zerubbabel and Joshua, the son of Josedek, the high priest, all those people are clearly after they built the temple and they're doing all this stuff that's happening then. So that Zechariah is definitely not this Zechariah. It's interesting, though, because Zechariah seems to be a good, you know, it's not a bad name to have, you know, because you had the Zechariah that was killed for calling out the king. And then you have this Zechariah that's keeping the king in check. And then you have the Zechariah that's the book of Zechariah, who's the prophet that's, you know, having great prophecies and understanding visions. So I don't know what it is about that name Zechariah, but there's some good men. There's at least 3 good men that had that name. I didn't realize how many good Zechariahs there were. And then you have, technically, you know, Zechariah, who's the father of John the Baptist, right? And so anyway. But he prospered as long as he sought the Lord. Notice that it says that he prospered. And it says as long as he sought the Lord, God made him to prosper. Go to Joshua. It made me think of this verse. You know, in Joshua 1:8. Joshua 1:8. I think it's Psalm 1. You know, whatsoever he shall do shall prosper. It talks about, blessed is the man that walketh not in the counsel of God, nor standeth in the way of sinners, nor sitteth in the seat of scornful. But his delight is in the law of the Lord, and in his law doth he meditate day and night, and whatsoever he shall do shall prosper. It talks about this, which is exactly what Joshua 1:8 is talking about. But talking about the fact of following God, reading his word, meditating upon his word, and how you're going to prosper and have good success when you do that. And so in Joshua 1:8 it says, "This book of the law shall not depart out of thy mouth, but thou shalt meditate therein day and night, that thou mayest observe to do according to all that is written therein. For then thou shalt make thy way prosperous, and then thou shalt have good success." This is as true as the day is long. This is back in Joshua's day that this is written. And then Psalm 1, you think of the sweet psalmist of Israel, David, that's writing that. And guess what? It's still true in the day of Uzziah. That as long as if you're following God, He will make you prosper. That doesn't mean that you're never going to have persecutions. It doesn't mean that you're not going to have tribulations. But here's the thing. God can make you prosper throughout all of that. Think of Job that went through trials and tribulations, but in the end, everything was doubled. Okay? And you say, well, it may not happen in our life or whatever. So be it. You will prosper in the end. No matter what happens, in this life or the next, you will prosper. But Jesus, a lot of times, is promising that you will prosper in this life and the next. And this isn't a prosperity doctrine, because prosperity doctrine is basically saying that you can have your good life now and not have any persecutions or anything going along with that. Okay? But through persecutions and through all that stuff, you can have a lot of prosperity in this life. And, it depends on what you mean by prosperity, I guess. Okay? If you're talking about, okay, I want to have a boat, I want to have a mansion, I want to have all this or that, I want to have all these material things, then you might not have that, okay? That's not what I'm saying is prosperous. I'm talking about the fact that you have food on the table, you have clothes on your back, you have a place that's not leaking, you're not living like a pauper, you have things, God's like, and I'd say that most people in our church, and I could definitely attest to this, that God has blessed me, as far as financially and all this stuff. And I'm not rich by any stretch of the imagination, but at the same time, I've never been begging bread, and all this other stuff, and I've never had to worry about those type of things. And I believe it's because God has blessed, and God has made me to prosper in those times. And there's times that the government's always trying to take more and more. Every time you have to go pay your property tax, it's just like, you might as well just punch me in the face because I don't own anything. And just all these things that you're constantly dealing with where you feel like you're just never getting ahead. But God always seems to just give you more, and there seems to always somehow make it through. And, I believe the reason that it's been the case on that, not that I'm perfect, but following God, keeping His commandments, going to church, doing the will of God, going soul winning, reading the Bible, memorizing the Bible. And when you do that, you're going to have good success, and you will prosper. Now, in my mind, I'm richer than most people in the world. Okay? But it's really perspective on what do you mean by rich. I have 3 beautiful girls. I have a beautiful wife. I have a house to live in. I have food on the table. I have a great church with great church members that are winning people to Christ on a weekly basis. We get to come together, hang out, eat some food, sing some songs, and you think about the Christmas time where you're spending time with family, eating all this food and all these things. To me, I'm a king, But it takes perspective to think of that, because you don't want to be envious of the wicked and of the sinners, because they're always going to have more technically in materials. But I'll trade those materials any day of the week for the relationships that I have with my family, with my friends, with my church, and with God. And so, but all that to say is that Uzziah, as long as he was seeking God, and isn't this the truth with all these kings? As soon as they stop seeking God, as soon as they stop keeping His commandments, what happens? They fall apart. And just history is repeating itself over and over and over and over and over again, to the point where you're reading through here like, come on. You're like, I've read this has happened, it's going to happen again, stop it. You're just like, you just want to talk to these people and be like, what are you doing? Do you not know what happened to your father? Do you not know what happened to your grandfather? What are you doing? Now, the interesting thing is Zechariah, I believe, go to 2 Chronicles chapter 29. I believe Hezekiah's mother is Zechariah's daughter. Okay? Because it says it. Okay? But I believe this is the Zechariah that we're dealing with here. So the Zechariah that is instructing Uzziah and helping him to live for the Lord and all that stuff, his daughter ends up being the mother of Hezekiah. And you kind of think about this. Why was Hezekiah such a great king? And you think about the people that influenced, because it's not like these men, that do great things like Hezekiah and all these other kings. they just did it on their own. They didn't have any. No, they had people bringing them up. Mothers. You think of Timothy, right? Of Eunice and Lois, and his mother and grandmother, and just the fact that they brought him up with the scriptures and all this stuff, and how that affects what type of man you'll be later on. And it's always interesting when you see these kings and it talks about their mother, and their mother was so-and-so. And a lot of times it mentions it because they were a good king. And the idea of how much power the mother has on their children and how they end up, or what they end up becoming when they grow up. Now, obviously, as fathers, we have a great responsibility to be good fathers and to raise our children right. But the mothers have so much power because they're there with them for such a longer period of time when you think about the father being out working and all that. Now, in 2 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 1, it says, Hezekiah began to reign when he was 5 and 20 years old, and he reigned 9 and 20 years in Jerusalem, and his mother's name was Abijah, the daughter of Zechariah. And he did that which was right in the sight of the Lord, according to all that David his father had done. So now we're getting into it. We haven't got there yet, so spoiler alert. Hezekiah is a good king. Now he's going to make mistakes, but at the same time, he doesn't really die like Jehoram does, where he has this disease, and he doesn't die like Abijah, who has a disease in his feet, and he doesn't, like some of these kings, they just kind of have this really bad ending. But we see here that Abijah is the daughter of Zechariah. Now, this could mean that it's his grandmother, because you have, after Uzziah, you have Jotham and Ahaz, okay? Now, he's 25 years old when he begins to reign, so that means that he's into this reign here. So it wouldn't be out of the ordinary that Ahaz married Zechariah's daughter, okay? But sometimes mother can mean grandmother, okay? So it's either a mother or grandmother. But I look at it as a Timothy, a Timothy where his mother and his grandmother brought him up. And Zechariah was obviously a great man. He understanding visions of the Lord and instructing Uzziah. And so don't discredit what effect you have on, the men out there that can be the leaders next, in the next generation. You ladies have a huge influence on that. And whether good or bad, it could have a huge influence on that. Now, going on with Uzziah, he ends up, he kind of restores Judah, after his father dies. But then in verse 6 of 2 Chronicles 26, he's going to build these towers. Or actually, first of all, he's going to go, before the towers, he's going to go and war against the Philistines. So the Philistines, you kind of think of the Philistines more so in the book of Judges. That's just constantly who they're going after and who they're fighting against is the Philistines. But we have the Philistines here, and you think of like the Gaza Strip, down there on the Mediterranean. Basically, Uzziah is going to take them out. In verse 6 here it says, And he went forth and warred against the Philistines and brake down the wall of Gath and the wall of Jabneh and the wall of Ashdod and built cities about Ashdod and among the Philistines. And God helped him against the Philistines and against the Arabians that dwelt in Gerbaal and the Mehunims, and the Ammonites gave gifts to Uzziah, and his name spread abroad even to the entering in of Egypt, for he strengthened himself exceedingly. Okay, so he's warring against the Philistines, and this is a case, actually, this is one of those cases where he's actually doing an offensive war, it looks like, at least as far as what the Bible is showing here. It doesn't say like the Philistines were oppressing him or anything like that, but he does an offensive war, and God helped him. And so obviously God was with Uzziah here and doing this, but obviously the Philistines were wicked. They've been wicked for a long time. But he basically takes out Gath. And you think of Goliath was of where? Gath, and he was that Philistine, right? And he builds cities around these places. So he's basically taking over the Philistines. And his name spread all the way even into the entering in of Egypt. Okay, so he's basically getting well known for his power, his might, and all that. Now, he builds these towers in Jerusalem in verse 9. It says, Moreover, Uzziah built towers in Jerusalem at the corner gate, and at the valley gate, and at the turning of the wall, and fortified them. Also he built towers in the desert, and digged many wells, for he had much cattle, both in the low country and in the plains, and husbandmen also, and vine dressers in the mountains and in Carmel, for he loved husbandry. So, it says that he builds these towers, so he's basically fortifying Jerusalem, but he's also got these towers where he's got these wells. So you can imagine, it doesn't really say why the towers are there, but you can imagine the fact that when you dig these wells out there, what's constantly happening in Genesis when they dig these wells? People take them over, or they fill them in, right? So you see this happening where you fill in a well, and then they move on, and then they go and dig another one, and then they fill that one in, and then they finally get a place where they're not going to be messed with, or they take it over. They just steal the well or whatever. And so you can imagine that he sets up these towers by these wells to basically defend the well. You know, people try to take over the well, and these people on the tower are shooting them down. So that's what I kind of see. He's kind of expanding out to where you can imagine if your army's going out somewhere, they need water. So he probably has these wells strategically set up to where he's got a well, he's got water where he's going, and they're fortified to where no one's going to be able to take out the well and all that. So I'm just reading into that as far as he's got this great army we're going to see and the fact that he's thinking about this. So he's a very smart leader, and God's obviously is prospering through following God and all this. So you can see Uzziah is not a bad king here. I mean, he's doing some good things. Now, going on from that, it says that he loved husbandry. Now, this is going to be interesting. I want you to keep that in the back of your mind when I get to the end of this sermon as far as dealing when you get into the prophets and what's written about Uzziah and all that. But he loves husbandry, and he's like a vine dresser and all this stuff. Okay, I want you to keep that in the back of your mind. But Uzziah had a great army. Now, going on in 2 Chronicles chapter 26 and verse 11, it says, "Moreover, Uzziah had an host of fighting men that went out to war by bands, according to the number of their account by the hand of Jael, the scribe, and Maaziah, the ruler, under the hand of Hananiah, one of the king's captains. The whole number of the chief of the fathers of the mighty men of valor were 2,600. So he had this special group. So these are kind of like his elites, if you will. It's kind of like this special group of fighters. You can almost look at this as like special forces, if you will, where he's got these 2,600 men that are these elite, valiant men. But then, under their hand is an army of over 300,000. So we see in verse 13, and under their hand was an army 300,000 and 7,500. So 300, 7,500, right? That made war with mighty power to help the king against the enemy. And Uzziah prepared for them throughout all the hosts shields and spears and helmets and habergeons and bows and slings to cast stones. So he's given them all these weapons. He's got a whole host of an army. He's got this elite group of fighting men of 2,600. And so he's getting pretty famous. I'm sure people are hearing about him, and he's winning these battles and setting up all this stuff. He's fortifying not only Jerusalem, but even just the nation. He's fortifying it. He's getting it ready and all this stuff. Now, he also has, what's interesting here is verse 15, are these engines of war, if you will. In verse 15, it says, "And he made in Jerusalem engines invented by cunning men to be on the towers and upon the bulwarks to shoot arrows and great stones withal. And his name spread far abroad, for he was marvelously helped till he was strong." Now, you can kind of think about this in history. You think of like, wars with England, and you think back in like the 12th century or 13th or 11th century and all that stuff about how they'd had these habergeons, right? And what's a habergeon? Well, or trebuchets. I'm thinking of a trebuchet. Habergeon is a little different, but a trebuchet is basically like this big thing that you wind up and then it throws like a rock. It's basically like this big arm that's throwing this rock. And I believe that's what you're dealing with. And you had these big machines that would like have these big arrows on them that they would shoot, okay? So, it's interesting because I don't know how far back they say those things were made, but in the Bible here, this is obviously pre-Babylonian, captivity and all that stuff with Nebuchadnezzar, that this is going on, that these instruments of war are there. So I don't know, what the historians say about it, but obviously this is true, that they made these inventions. They invented these engines. Now, engine doesn't mean it's like steam engine or gas engine here. Now, engine just means something mechanical, okay? So anything that's mechanical, and, I believe it. I'm sure there was steel involved. It's not like we're in the Stone Age here, and I use that loosely because that's like the world's view of like, oh, we didn't know how to make a wheel until such and such year and all this garbage. But they had steel and all this stuff, and I'm sure they, you think of like the Egyptians, they had a lot of knowledge on these type of things. But anyway, it's just interesting to see that. There's another place in Ezekiel where it talks about engines of war and all that, which is interesting because Ezekiel 38 and 39, it's in 38, which is the Battle of Gog and Magog, which happens after the 1,000-year reign, which hasn't even happened yet. So what those engines of war are, I don't know. But you can definitely see how in the future, like where we're at, we have engines of war, don't we? I'm sure it's different than Uzziah. I'm not saying Uzziah had tanks up there or even cannons, but I mean, obviously they were, inventing these things. And obviously throughout history, it's been going up and up and up and up to where we definitely have we have drones now, okay? That's our engines of war, it seems like nowadays. But anyway, he was marvelously helped. And I think that's interesting how it says that. Because he was helped by God. God was helping him during this whole time. And it says, till he was strong. Okay, so basically that's where we lead up. Okay, so he gets strong, then he's going to get high and lifted up. And Uzziah it makes me think of Nebuchadnezzar a little bit. Because the same thing happens with Nebuchadnezzar where he's high and lifted up, and then God has to humble him. Okay, actually Nebuchadnezzar has a better ending than Uzziah, to be honest with you. But in verse 16 here, so in 2 Chronicles 26, verse 16, it says, but when he was strong, his heart was lifted up to his destruction. For he transgressed against the Lord his God and went into the temple of the Lord to burn incense upon the altar of incense. Now, in 2 Kings, if you're just reading 2 Kings, what did it say? God smote him with leprosy, right? It just tells you that he was smitten with leprosy, but you don't really know why. But in 2 Chronicles, it tells us why. That he was trying to go in and burn incense. This is almost a callback to Saul. I mean, if you think of Saul, how he was trying to do the sacrifice that he wasn't supposed to do, right? That's where Samuel came in, and that's where Saul's like, well, I forced myself and did this, But Uzziah is basically just saying, yeah, I'm going to do this. And he ends up getting mad at the priest. But you have to really look up to Azariah, the priest, because he stands up to the king here, okay? So you can imagine, you're standing up to the authority of the land and saying, no, get out of here. And it really shows you, too, that, there was supposed to be they had a king, but the king wasn't like all powerful with whatever he says goes. No, they're supposed to follow the law of God. And Azariah here is following the law of God, saying, no, it's only supposed to be the sons of Aaron. And notice that God's going to be backing him here because of what he does to Uzziah. And so this is a great example of someone going against the state authority when it goes against the Bible. And he also had a bunch of men that followed him with him. And this is what you need. You need people to stand up for this stuff. And today in our society, when everybody's just losing their minds, it's literally, we live in an insane society where they think there's more than two genders and they can't figure out the difference between black and white pretty much. It's really crazy how far out there everybody is. But you need people to stand up because there's a lot of people that would look at what we believe and say, well, I don't necessarily stand with them, but as far as their beliefs on that, but I still think they're right to a certain extent, meaning that they would hold to us as far as our stance on sodomy, on adultery, on all these things that people come at us for, the death penalty. And all these things that people are just constantly saying, you guys are wicked and all this stuff. Most people, I believe in West Virginia, would be like, yeah, they're right about that. But they're not going to stand up with us because they're afraid of persecution. Because they're afraid of the mob, that loud minority of reprobates that are trying to take control of our country, and which have taken control of our country in many cases. And what you need is some valiant men to stand up and say no. And don't let the one man that's standing there be standing there alone, okay? And so this is a case where Azariah is going to stand up with this, but there's other men that are beside him. So he's not doing this alone. And in verse 17 it says, And Azariah the priest went in after him, and with him 80 priests of the Lord that were valiant men. That's 80 men. 80 men went with him. We shouldn't have to fight these battles alone. Now, obviously, we always have the Lord with us, but how much more? When you see a man of God standing up for the truth and they're trying to shut him down, that's where all the men of God need to stand up and say, no, I'm with that guy. You guys need to stand down. And we need to be like Azariah. If the man of God is Azariah, then we need to be those 80 men, those 80 valiant men that say, nope, we're with him. And you're going to have to deal with all of us. And if everybody did that, once those 80 men stood up, you know what? A lot of other people are going to stand up too. But people are a lot of times scared. They're scared of the consequences. They're scared of what's going to happen to them, and especially with jobs, because in a lot of these cases, your job is being threatened. Your livelihood is being threatened. And that's why people just want to not say anything. They just want to sit in darkness and say, well, I agree with them, but I don't want to deal with that. Now, going on from this, in verse 18 it says, And they withstood Uzziah the king, and said unto him, It appertaineth not unto thee, Uzziah, to burn incense unto the Lord, but to the priests, the sons of Aaron, that are consecrated to burn incense. Go out of the sanctuary, for thou hast trespassed, neither shall it be for thine honor from the Lord God. So they're not only saying, listen, this is only for the priests, the sons of Aaron, but also for them that are consecrated. So it's not even just that it's for the sons of Aaron. They have to be consecrated to do this. This is a whole process. And you're circumventing all of this and going against the Word of God here. And he's calling them out for it. And in verse 19, Then Uzziah was wroth and had a censer in his hand to burn incense. And while he was wroth with the priest, the leprosy in his... while he was wroth... I went down a verse there. The leprosy even rose up in his forehead before the priest in the house of the Lord from beside the incense altar. And Azariah the chief priest and all the priests looked upon him, and behold, he was leprous in his forehead, and they thrust him out from thence. Yea, himself hasted also to go out, because the Lord had smitten him. It's interesting, he's just like, yeah, get me out of here. At that point, when he saw that he was leprous, he's like, get me out of here. Because at that point he realized, he's in trouble. Okay? Uzziah doesn't really have a happy ending after this. After all that stuff where he's following God, doing what he should be doing, God was helping him, he gets this in his head that he should go burn incense against what the Bible says, and is still going to do it even after all the priests told him not to do it. So notice that he had a warning. He was doing this, the priest warned him and said, get out of here, and then he got wroth and he didn't do it. So he even had a chance to get out of this, okay? But he's going to be a leper unto the day of his death. He does not get cured of this leprosy. Okay? So in verse 21 it says, And Uzziah the king was a leper unto the day of his death, and dwelt in a several house, being a leper, for he was cut off from the house of the Lord, and Jotham his son was over the king's house, judging the people of the land. So this is definitely where you see co-regency here. Okay? Because Jotham, and you'll see this even with their reigns and where it lines up with other kings and stuff like that, but Jotham is reigning while his dad's still alive, and he's a leper, and he's basically separated. And that phrase, a several house, I believe it's talking about a separate house, meaning it's a severed. You can see the word sever in there. Okay, so it's basically a house that's severed away from, the rest of Jerusalem, right? And this is brought up in the New Testament. You think every several ability. It's not talking about several as in like a couple. You know what I mean? It's several as in separate abilities, like severed abilities, right? And so, or every several gate, it talks about the pearls, right? On the 12 gates, every several gate had one pearl. Well, they all had pearls. It's not saying like every other gate, you know what I mean? It's saying every several gate, meaning every separate gate had a pearl. It was made of one pearl, right? And so, just to kind of understand what that means, this is kind of a great example to understand that, because I think we all know that the lepers were supposed to go outside the camp saying unclean, and basically going outside of that, they were not to be with everybody else. So he's basically living out there as a leper for the rest of his life. Now, notice what it says in verse 22. It So 2 Chronicles verse 22, 2 Chronicles 26 verse 22, it says, "Now the rest of the acts of Uzziah, first and last, did Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amos, write." Now this is where it's interesting, because Uzziah is actually where Isaiah is preaching, and he preaches through other kings besides Uzziah, but also the minor prophets start with that. So Uzziah is kind of the marker of the kings of where the prophets start. Because what's the first prophet? Isaiah. The first major prophet is Isaiah, the first minor prophet is Hosea, and that's who they both start with. And I'm going to show you that. Go to Isaiah chapter 1. Isaiah chapter 1. You may not have known that, but that's just the truth. Before this, you're not really in the major prophets. You had like other people that were mentioned and all this other stuff, but you know, it's just interesting to see where we're starting off here. Now, Isaiah 1. I actually want to turn there because there's something I want you to see. Not too far. So obviously at the beginning of Isaiah it tells you like what kings were around when he was prophesying and all this. But Isaiah 1, verse 1, it says, "The vision of Isaiah the son of Amos, which he saw concerning Judah and Jerusalem in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah. Hear, O ye heavens, and give ear, O earth, for the Lord hath spoken. I have nourished and brought up children, and they have rebelled against me." So who's he writing to? He's writing concerning Judah and Jerusalem. Now, I believe that chapters 1 through 6 is dealing with that time period of Uzziah. Okay, so Uzziah is not necessarily mentioned by name in these chapters, but it's during his reign. Okay, you say, well, why do you think that? Well, in Isaiah 6:1, it's in the year that Uzziah died. Okay, so in Isaiah 6:1, notice what it says. Isaiah 6:1, it says, "And in the year that King Uzziah died, I saw also the Lord sitting upon a throne, and high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple." And we know this passage dealing with the seraphims and dealing, "Here am I, send me." So Isaiah 6, I believe, is probably, Uzziah might have still been alive when he did this. It's just basically saying this is in the year that he died. So it could have very well been the vision that's going on during the time that Uzziah is about to die. And then go to chapter 7, verse 1. Chapter 7, verse 1. And I believe this is chronological because when you get down to Isaiah like 36 to 39, you're dealing with Hezekiah. And then after that, it's not really dealing with history. It's dealing with all these visions and stuff like that, And so the history, because where did he preached from Uzziah to Hezekiah? That's what it says at the very beginning. So it makes sense that it would be a chronological thing. Now, in verse 1 there of chapter 7, it says, "And it came to pass in the days of Ahaz, the son of Jotham, the son of Uzziah." So we kind of skipped over Jotham. Now, again, Jotham and Ahaz only reigned for 16 years. Yeah, 16 years each, so they're not like huge reigns there. So maybe there's just not much. There's not anything mentioned about Jotham there. But obviously he was probably, I'm sure, preaching and doing whatever he was doing during that time. So I believe from Isaiah 1 to 6, that's where you're dealing with King Uzziah. Okay. Now, like I said, remember it said he loved husbandry? Well, Isaiah 5 is an interesting passage because Isaiah 5 is dealing with the vineyard of the Lord. And God, Isaiah is preaching this, but God is giving this parable of a vineyard that's not being kept. Isn't that interesting that it mentions that Uzziah is like all about vineyards and all about husbandry? And the vision that he's giving here in this prophecy and all this. And obviously, I believe this is talking about what's going to happen in the future with Jesus and, how he sent people into his vineyard and they beat some and then they ended up killing the Lord Jesus. And the vineyard's obviously representing Judea. It's representing Jerusalem. It's representing all that, right? But it's just interesting that it mentions that he loved husbandry. It's kind of like, what? Okay. What valuable information does that give me? That he loved husbandry. All right, he liked grapes. He liked growing grapes. I don't know. But when you think about, okay, well, Isaiah 5 is during Uzziah's time, and I'm sure these things are being preached to the king, right? And he loves husbandry, and God just happens to use husbandry as an example to preach to them. Okay, I just kind of think that's interesting on how that applies there. Now, going on, go to Hosea chapter 1, just to show you that the minor prophets start off with a prophet that's preaching in Uzziah's day. This is also another reason why I would say Uzziah the king. I wouldn't say Azariah. It's not wrong to say Azariah, but notice that Uzziah is always mentioned here. When you're dealing with these prophets, they're talking about Uzziah. They say Uzziah, so I'm going to say Uzziah. Okay. You're like, I'm going to use Ozias, oh, fine, that's fine. I don't care. You go with New Testament spelling there. It doesn't really matter. But Hosea chapter 1 and verse 1, it says, "The word of the Lord that came unto Hosea, the son of Beeri, in the days of Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel." Sounds just like Isaiah, really. Isn't it all the kings that Isaiah was there? So you can see how Isaiah and Hosea are starting at the same mark, which also shows you, too, that it starts over, right? When you go from Isaiah all the way to Daniel, that's why they're called the major prophets. Because you could look at them and be like, well, Daniel's only 12 chapters, Zechariah's 14. Well, Daniel's obviously a main character, though, right? Daniel is someone that's just, everybody knows about Daniel and all that stuff. Whereas Hosea, Zechariah, and all that stuff, they're definitely minor as far as characters, okay? But you can definitely see Isaiah goes down to Daniel, and then it kicks right back into where you were at with Isaiah, okay? And so that's why I believe it's chronological. And it's chronological, I believe, from Hosea down to Malachi. And I believe this would include, and we'll see, go to Amos chapter 1. Amos chapter 1 also shows us that this was during the days of Uzziah the king. And actually, Amos is written pretty much solely during that time, that during Uzziah the king. Okay, meaning that this whole book is written during that time. So in your studies, you could be looking at that and kind of seeing, okay, what's going on, when it's talking about Judah particularly. Now, some of this stuff is all towards Israel, okay, which you can make sense, right? Because a lot of these minor prophets are like preaching against Israel because they're about to be taken out, right? Israel's still a nation during the time that Uzziah is preaching, the time that Amos is preaching. Now, Amos in verse 1 there, Amos 1:1, it says, "The words of Amos, who was among the herdmen of Tekoa, which he saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake." Now, it says that, the reason I point this out too is the fact that Joel was between there. And I believe it's chronological, so I believe Joel would be in that group too. And you'll see stuff in Joel about Jerusalem and Judah and all that stuff. And I believe a lot of stuff in Joel obviously is way future, meaning stuff that's going to happen in our future. But there's also the immediate future that you can look at too. Okay, so the reason that I bring this up is because it kind of tells you, okay, where's Joel located at? Okay, I believe that he'd have to be in Uzziah's time. You say, why? Because if he wasn't, it wouldn't be chronological. Because Amos is definitely in Uzziah's time. Now, Hosea goes past that, but see, I believe Hosea started prophesying before Amos. Does that make sense? And that's why it's chronological, but they both started in Uzziah's time. That means Joel had to start in Uzziah's time. Because, now, if it would have been the fact that, okay, he started, it wouldn't work chronologically, okay? So I believe Joel has to be in that mix too. And go to Amos chapter 2 and verse 4, we actually see a judgment that God's bringing upon Judah, and I believe it's during Uzziah's reign. Why? Because it's during the time of Uzziah. That makes sense, right? So in Amos chapter 2 and verse 4, "Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Judah and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they have despised the law of the Lord and have not kept his commandments, and their lies caused them to err after that which their fathers have walked. But I will send a fire upon Judah, and it shall devour the palaces of Jerusalem." So it's obviously but you could say, well, it didn't seem like they were that bad. Yeah, well, they're burning incense in high places and sacrificing in high places. That stuff's kind of going off in the background, but as you're going through these kings like Joash, Amaziah, Uzziah, isn't it always keeps mentioning, yeah, they did right inside the Lord, but the people still did this. So you got to understand that just because the king's doing right doesn't mean that the rest of the people are doing right, and that God's going to not take it out on the whole country for what they're doing. Okay. Now, what's interesting, and when I think of Uzziah, this is what I think of. And maybe you have thought of this or not, but it's about this earthquake. Okay. And it's about this earthquake that's going on during Uzziah's reign. So you saw in Amos, right? Amos 1:1 talks about that he's prophesying. He saw concerning Israel in the days of Uzziah, king of Judah, and in the days of Jeroboam, the son of Joash, king of Israel, 2 years before the earthquake. The earthquake, okay? There's this earthquake that's mentioned in this passage right here, but also go to Zechariah chapter 14. There's this major earthquake that apparently happened during Uzziah's reign that is like ringing through the scriptures. And I believe this earthquake is actually Zechariah 14, I think, is very clear that it's an example earthquake of what's going to happen in the future. Okay, of this devastating earthquake. And so much that when Amos is writing this, he's like, just so you know where we're at, it's 2 years before the earthquake. Okay, so this had to be a major earthquake for that to be a marker. It's kind of like if you're to say, well, this is like 5 years after the flood, right? It's a major event. Everybody knows what you're talking about. He didn't say like what earthquake, where it happened. He said the earthquake, right? And Zechariah chapter 14, I'm going to read verse 5, and then we're going to see some context. So Zechariah chapter 14, verse 5, it says, "And ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Hazel. Yea, ye shall flee like as ye fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah king of Judah, and the Lord my God shall come, and all the saints with thee." Isn't that interesting? Because Zechariah is pointing this out, saying this is the earthquake that happened in the days of Uzziah. Amos is saying, listen, this is in the days of Uzziah, 2 years before the earthquake. This earthquake is a major event, some cataclysmic event that happened. And we see stuff like this happen even after the Bible was written. You see Pompeii, where Pompeii was completely annihilated by a volcano. And you see earthquakes annihilating whole cultures and all these different things. Some catastrophe had happened, obviously, with this earthquake. Because it's used, actually, to prophesy about end times, okay? So now backtrack, go to verse 1 there, and see what we're talking about in this vision that Zechariah is showing here. Because it's not saying that this event's happening during Uzziah's reign. He's saying that it was like that. They're going to flee like they fled from the earthquake that happened in Uzziah's day, okay? So it's basically using that as an example. It'd be kind of like using Sodom and Gomorrah as an example when Babylon's going to be destroyed, and using that as an example. But in Zechariah 14, verse 1, it says, "Behold, the day of the Lord cometh, and thy spoil shall be divided in the midst of thee." All right, so we're talking about the day of the Lord here. "For I will gather all nations against Jerusalem to battle, and in the city shall be taken, and the houses rifled, and women ravished, and half of the city shall go forth into captivity, and the residue of the people shall not be cut off from the city. Then shall the Lord go forth and fight against those nations as when he fought in the day of battle. And his feet shall stand in the day upon the Mount of Olives, which is before Jerusalem on the east, and the Mount of Olives shall cleave in the midst thereof toward the east and toward the west, and there shall be a very great valley, and a half of the mountain shall remove toward the north, and half of it toward the south. And ye shall flee to the valley of the mountains, for the valley of the mountains shall reach unto Hazel. Yea, ye shall flee like as ye fled from before the earthquake in the days of Uzziah king of Judah, and the Lord my God shall come, and all the saints with thee. And it shall come to pass in that day that the light shall not be clear nor dark, but it shall be one day which shall be known to the Lord, not day nor night, but it shall come to pass that at evening time it shall be light. And it shall be in that day that living water shall go out of Jerusalem, half of them toward the former sea, and half of them toward the hinder sea. And in summer and in winter shall it be, and the Lord shall be king over all the earth, and in that day shall there be one Lord, and his name one." So, what is this talking about? I believe this is talking about when Jesus comes on a white horse, the Battle of Armageddon. Okay? Now, you could say, well, maybe it's talking about the day of the Lord as far as when he comes in the clouds. And remember, when you're in the Old Testament, you can have leaps, okay, meaning that you can have big time gaps between, even in the same verse, okay? So just because it starts off with the day of the Lord cometh, doesn't mean that it can't be jumping to the Battle of Armageddon. Because at the end here, I believe you're talking about the 1,000-year reign, where he's going to reign and he's going to rule over all the earth, right? But this earthquake, it's interesting, when you're dealing with the day of the Lord, there's a lot of earthquakes that happen at the end times, okay? So you can study this out for yourself and see where you think it lies. But I'll say this, I believe this is happening in the end time somewhere as far as what's going on right here. I personally believe we're dealing with the Battle of Armageddon, and I believe that earthquake actually splits a mountain in half. Like, it makes a valley. And it makes me think of the Valley of Decision, the Valley of Jehoshaphat. It makes me think of the winepress of the wrath of God, where there's going to be blood up to the horse bridles, when the marriage supper of the Lamb. That's what it makes me think about. And I'll give you my reasons. But I'll say this, it's either when Jesus comes back in the clouds, or it's in the Battle of Armageddon, okay? Because obviously he comes in the clouds to gather together his elect, but then we're all going to come with him on white horses. That's why one of the reasons, too, is because the Lord my God shall come and all the saints with thee, meaning that we're going to be coming with him in the clouds on white horses with two-edged swords in our hands, and it talks about taking out the nations and all this stuff. Now, Joel chapter 3, again, remember Joel was written during the times of Uzziah, and there's definitely end times prophecy there. This is where we get the Valley of Decision, right? The Valley of the Jehoshaphat, which links to Revelation, obviously. But in Joel chapter 3 and verse 15, it says, the sun and the moon shall be darkened, and the stars shall withdraw their shining. The Lord also shall roar out of Zion and utter his voice from Jerusalem, and the heavens and the earth shall quake. But the Lord will be the hope of his people and the strength of the children of Israel. So obviously, when we know, when he comes in the clouds, I'll just show you that. Go to Revelation chapter 6. When Jesus is coming, there's going to be this great earthquake. There's a great earthquake when he died on the cross. Earthquakes are like a significant marker as far as events when God's doing something. But I think the strongest evidence is that we're dealing with the Battle of Armageddon, the Supper of the Lamb, and all that. Now, but you can have your own thoughts on this. If you say it's when he comes in the clouds, I wouldn't be against you. But in Revelation chapter 6 and verse 12, it says, and behold, when he had opened the sixth seal, and lo, there was a great earthquake. And the sun became black as sackcloth of hair, and the moon became as blood. And the stars of heaven fell. And we see all this as far as, in verse 17, for the great day of his wrath has come, and who shall be able to stand? So there's no doubt that there's an earthquake when Jesus is coming in the clouds. And then when he starts to pour out his wrath, there's another earthquake. So there's an earthquake, and go to Revelation chapter 8. But I believe there's an earthquake that's going to outdo all those, okay? And I believe that's what it's talking about. That's why it's saying, is just, like you fled from the earthquake in Uzziah's day. And I think, and the reason I'm pointing this out, because I want you to think about how massive that earthquake had to have been during Uzziah's day. And why they're bringing that up as a marker of time. It was obviously a massive event. And I haven't looked up in the secular world as far as if they have any thoughts on this, or if they even think that this is something that happened, or if there's any theories on that. I'm just showing you what the Bible says about it. But in Revelation 8 and verse 5, so this is after the rapture. There's silence in heaven for a space of half an hour, and it says, an angel took, in verse 5, the censer and filled it with fire of the altar and cast it into the earth, and there were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. And the seven angels, which had the seven trumpets, prepared themselves to sound. So before they even sound any of the trumpets, they throw fire in the earth, and there's this earthquake that's going on. But this is where I really believe this earthquake is talked about, where it's basically linking Uzziah's earthquake to what's going to happen in the future. Go to Revelation chapter 16. Revelation chapter 16. It just seems to fit with Zechariah 14 a lot more, because we know that Jesus is going to be down here on a horse, and we're going to be with him, that he's going to gather all the nations together, right? That's the Battle of Armageddon. He's gathering all these nations together to destroy them, and it really seems to fit with that more than anything else. But in Revelation chapter 16, verse 18, it says, and there were voices and thunderings and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were upon the earth. So mighty an earthquake and so great. And the great city was divided in three parts, and the cities of the nations fell. And great Babylon came in remembrance before God to give unto her the cup of the wine of the fierceness of his wrath, and every island fled away, and the mountains were not found. Sounds familiar because wasn't there a mountain that was basically going to be broken in half? But, the city was broken into, the great city, I believe is talking about Jerusalem, is broken into 3 parts. But Zechariah, in chapter 14, is saying it's going to be like that happened with Uzziah. That's amazing. That's crazy to think about. Okay, there's been some, big earthquakes in history, I'm sure. But this earthquake that's going to make every nation fall, and that's going to break mountains up to where there's not going to be any mountains found, and there's no island. You can think of tsunamis, right? Because the earthquakes can cause tsunamis and all that stuff. That it's going to cause tsunamis. It's going to just cover whole islands. And you can think about that. And Zechariah is saying, yeah, it's going to be like what happened in Uzziah's day. So that's why I think of Uzziah in an earthquake. Okay, so me personally, that's how I remember Uzziah. When I think of the kings, I'm like Uzziah and that earthquake that happened in his days. And it doesn't really tell you much about it until you get to Zechariah, and then you're like, okay, this was a major earthquake. If it's being compared to the earthquake that hasn't been since men have been on the earth, right? Meaning the earthquake there's never been an earthquake that's been like that yet. Okay. Now at the end of the chapter here, going back to 2 Chronicles chapter 26, verse 23. Uzziah, he's a leper till the day of his death, and he's not going to be buried like the rest of his fathers were. He's going to be buried with his fathers, technically, but not in the sepulchers of the kings, okay? So in verse 23 here, so 2 Chronicles chapter 26, verse 23, so Uzziah slept with his fathers, and they buried him with his fathers in the field of the burial which belongeth to the kings. For they said, he is a leper, and Jotham his son reigned in his stead. So I don't believe he was buried in the sepulchres. And if you remember, Jotham was kind of the same way, where they didn't bury him in the sepulchres of the kings, and there wasn't, basically no one desired him, and all that. And Uzziah kind of had that ending, where he's a leper, and they pretty much just like buried him, in the field of the kings, and kept him away from even the sepulcher of the kings. They didn't want that leprosy anywhere close to where they had to be again. It's interesting because you kind of think it's 6 feet under, you don't have to worry about it. But if you're in a sepulcher where you're putting other people, you got to go back in there. Okay, so, but that's Uzziah. He obviously did great things for the Lord, and it really just shows you that if you just stick with the Bible and stick with the commandments of God, you'll prosper. But if you deviate from that and you try to go against what the Bible teaches, then there's going to be massive consequences. And I'm not saying Uzziah is in hell. I believe Uzziah is probably a saved man that's in heaven. But it doesn't mean that's the way you want to go out. You want to go out on top. You want to go out serving the Lord. So let's end with a word of prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, Lord, we thank you for today. And thank you for your word. Thank you for these passages that we can learn. And, Lord, just interesting stuff to see of history. And, Lord, we just pray that you be with us throughout the rest of this week and help us to bring glory to your name. And I pray that you be with those in our church that aren't feeling well. I think specifically at Bethany, just good to see her in church. But, Lord, just pray that you be with her and heal her. And Lord, we just thank you for the Russell family and just pray that you be with all those that maybe not be feeling well or dealing with any other issues in the church or anything like that. Lord, we love you. Pray also in Jesus Christ's name. Amen.